You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics to culture and the arts.
Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Nassim and I will be your host. Today we are discussing the response of the European Union to the far-right Israeli government. Since forming what is widely considered the most extreme government in Israeli history, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has pushed ahead with a number of reforms which critics say will be the death of democracy in Israel. The most controversial aspect, perhaps, is the overhaul of the judiciary. Many of you would have read about it. It's quite a complicated topic. We may touch upon this today. The reaction has been quite unprecedented. Israelis themselves, Zionist Jewish organizations in the diaspora, Israel's allies, the US itself, has expressed grave concerns over the reforms that are being pushed through. But today we will focus specifically on the European Union and maybe on some of the other areas. And to do that, I am joined by Ramus Boserup. Rasmus is an executive director of EuroMed Rights. He has a PhD in Algerian history and anthropology. He previously worked as a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies, focusing on power and politics in the Middle East and North Africa. Prior to this, Rasmus served as executive director of the Danish-Egyptian Dialogue Institute in Cairo. Rasmus, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Nassim. It's a pleasure to be with you on the show.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, this conversation really was prompted not only by what's happening in Israel, but also following your article which you published on the Middle East Monitor. I thought it touched on a number of issues which we will look in greater detail. But to begin with, what has been the response of the European Union generally to the right-wing government of Israel?
Well, I think in general, if we take it that way, the response has been disappointing and not really up to the measures of what we are seeing. And when I say disappointing, it's because the EU has, in its overall approach, adopted the classic position that has taken of correctly denouncing, pointing out flaws, but not really acting upon this. And what prompted the op-ed you refer to is that we in the network, EuroMed Rights, with its members on the ground, believe that it's time now for the EU to basically step up and follow up with more concrete action. So what the EU has typically, and I would say on one level correctly done, is to call out the lack of applications of international law and the breaches of human rights when they come, and basically mentioned them and expressed concerns with them, and insisted on this two-state solution as its political response from the European Union. Now, we as a human rights organization, Human Rights, we are of course not necessarily particularly interested in the political response, but we're interested in making sure that the EU takes a clear human rights inspired and human rights based approach to this issue, and in particular look at the grave violations that we are seeing, and in particular when it comes to the new government. And I think we haven't seen that clearly enough. When it comes to this new government as it comes in, it takes a clear stance of saying we cannot accept that the position that they take up on annexation of the territories that are occupied, which is in dire breach with international law, that they're actually being blatantly rolled out under our eyes without acting. So the EU should step up, and it should basically follow its own core principles of having a human rights-based and humanitarian law-based approach to its policies with other countries, including Israel. That's what we're calling for.
You mentioned the classic position, which is normally what we see, the condemnations, but there really isn't any kind of action. We'll contrast that with how they responded to the Ukraine, for example, later in our conversation. But do you see signs that the classic position, the fact that they can no longer maintain the classic position, and there are those who are bucking that trend? An example comes to mind is the Barcelona mayor who cut ties with Israel over its human rights abuse, and that comes at a time when there's growing concerns in the US, as I said, by Jewish Zionist organizations in the US, here in Europe as well. So I think, is it really a time when we may see organizations, including the European Union, bucking the trend and moving away from the classic position which you described?
Yeah, I think, and I do dearly believe it should be. I think we are now at we could say, with the current government that includes these extremist political parties who openly say that they will actually breach international law, including parts of Israel's own jurisdiction. I think with such a government, it is becoming incredibly complicated for international actors. Of course, the US you mentioned, but also, and very explicitly, I would say, the European Union, to withhold a kind of mid position of condemning to one and the other side and say that we still want to see this two-state solution come out, and it's regrettable, and we have concern, and so on. I mean, and then continuing what we could say a business as usual with keeping their trade agreements, keeping the various sort of instruments of cooperation with the state of Israel up and running with the current government. And I think that is, so the Barcelona mayor, I think we welcome that step of saying that there should be action. It is no longer possible to keep that sort of open position. I mean, it is a moment when it is so blatant what this new government is actually expressing in terms of will. And let me just here open a small paragraph, if you allow me. I mean, we are not in any way believing that this new government is a massive deviation from what we've seen as a continued policy over many years in Israel. I think it's clear that we've had an de facto annexation policy going on, but it's just been now owned up to by the current government, and in another way. So we can say it's a step further in saying we will actually do this. We don't care about this international law and the principle based on which we're actually having relations with the EU. So what we suggest now is to say that needs to be met by a firm stance. Otherwise, it doesn't really make sense to have these agreements that we are making based on human rights and international law, as the EU normally does. So in a way, we just believe that the response should be appropriately rolled out now, looking at the various agreements we have with Israel, whether it's in trade, whether it's international channels of dialogue, and so on and so forth. And take the appropriate measures to stop them when necessary, to use them to open a dialogue much more critically and much more sort of upfront, basically being willing to cut the ties when needed to make sure that the EU isn't complicit in upholding illegal acts under international law.
I mean, it's interesting you should say that. I've been watching the response quite closely, partly because it is my job to do that, and it's quite striking how the contrast between the reaction to the judicial overhaul and publications of the reports by Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and B'Tselem, and organizations like yourself, who have been describing Israel as an apartheid state, of having committing the crime of apartheid. So you have, for 2 years, those concerns have been laid bare in front of the eyes of the international community. There's a wall-to-wall consensus, but that didn't move anyone, and no one really actually responded to that. And the response is as though now Israel's on a cliff edge and democracy will somehow be completely eroded through this judicial overhaul, and all those reports and years of warning and concerns over the practice of apartheid made no inroads into Jewish organizations, Zionist organizations, as I say, and also the American government, and also the EU itself. I mean, just I think a month ago, Joseph Borrell, who basically said that describing Israel as an apartheid state is anti-Semitic. So you say is quite, is on the, it explains the situation really, really well. Well, my question, I think I want to get to the next question about the judicial review itself, and why are Europeans concerned over this issue? As we know, the Netanyahu coalition begins with a demand or a claim that the whole of historic Palestine is part of Greater Israel. We know what Netanyahu means by this. What do EU officials understand by this? Do they understand that this is really a claim to continue and maintain the ethnic colonial expansion which we've seen over the last many decades? How do European officials understand what is coming from the horse's mouth, that the whole of we want to expand and make claim to Greater Israel?
Yeah, it's a good question. What they actually put into these claims that comes out of Tel Aviv and from the current government right now. I mean, we know, as you say, what Netanyahu and his government mean by it. That they actually they believe that they have a right which has been turned over in various international legal bodies, and that the West Bank, the Golan, Gaza, and so on and so forth, everything beyond the 67 borders, they are occupied territories. They are not to be altered in any way. Any settlement is illegal. Any alteration of the population there is illegal under international law, and that is, of course, not recognized by the current government of Israel. And I think that we know that they don't recognize that position. I think the EU does and has at many multiple points taken up the stand that they base themselves on these resolutions, the UN Security Council resolution, the International Court of Justice, and so in a way they pay service to this. They as an institution say we approach it on this basis, condemning, expressing concern, and so on, whenever breaches are observed. I think, of course, the various positions that we're juggling with two things here, right? There's the question of how they see that Netanyahu may position himself, and I think there will probably be different opinions within the EU. We have some EU countries who are quite critical of what goes on, countries like Portugal, Luxembourg, Malta, Ireland, Belgium, and so on. And then you would have other countries that are much less willing to actually tackle these very clear signs coming out of the Israeli government, and that would include a lot of the classical big countries in foreign policy making in the EU, so Germany, to some extent also France, Spain, so on and so forth. So they will be more reluctant to push for it, if not directly hostile. And I think that is one of the challenges in finding consensus internally and figuring out. But the EU as an institution is built on respect for international law and for international human rights law, and I think that is where the EU will constantly find itself. So the question that is now coming to the EU, given how openly the current government of Israel is actually admitting that we do not recognize this, we do not recognize these international legal obligations we have, and so on and so forth, that pressures back on the EU to basically reconsider its position. That's also why we've sent out this op-ed recently saying that this is the moment when the EU, it's a moment of reckoning. You put it as they're on the cliff, but for us, it's a moment of reckoning. Of course, when you look internally, there are all these ongoing debates inside Israeli society about whether this government is too radical in its sort of wish to sort of restrict the powers of the Supreme Court and so on and so forth. But in terms of the occupation issue and the annexation issue that we're discussing here as the international law issue, I think it's clear that this puts a tremendous pressure on the EU, that the EU has to take that, and it cannot simply dodge that question. And this is why we believe that now is the moment to put it out there for the EU, to put pressure on the EU to say you need to seriously consider whether you can actually uphold. Can you afford as a European Union to not act on this anymore, but keep on just express concern? And we don't think that's the right approach anymore. There may at some point back in the day have been an argument for saying we need to sort of get the Oslo process up and running and sort of try to bring partners together. We think that we're beyond that. We think we're way beyond it and probably have been for a long while, but it's just clearly that right now you have a government that actually itself says we're beyond it. We're not really going to support any of these international legal obligations that we have. We'll not honor them. So in that sense, the EU should take the consequence and cut the ties where needed and basically make the revisions of their trade policies and their various agreements and dialogues with the Israeli government, because it so blatantly says that it has no intention of respecting these treaties and bodies.
I want to get to the EU response in a minute. Can we establish what the EU position is on a number of key issues? We've spoken about the fact that the EU claims to uphold international law, and in my reading over the last 10 years or so, as you know, many Palestinians and analysts will say the US is not an honest broker when it comes to Israel-Palestine. There was a hope that the European Union could become a bit more balanced on this issue. It even introduced, guidelines on boycotting settlement goods. Of course, that's not been implemented thoroughly, but there was a sign that somehow the European Union could be a bit more balanced and measured than the US, but that's not been the case. It seems it's still following where the US goes. It will not go beyond the US or Washington on this issue. That seems to be how it's going. But in terms of its position, what are its clear positions on Jerusalem, the occupation? As you know, there's more and more American officials are saying there is no occupation. Even the current administration does not like to use the word occupation when it describes what's happening in the West Bank. And just the other week, the former U.S. Secretary of State, who I forget his name, under Trump, basically said that the whole of the West Bank, all of Greater Israel, was given to the Jews by God. So we see that the discussion or the vocabulary around occupation is completely being removed. What is the EU position on those key issues? Occupation, Jerusalem, settlements, and then we can move on to other aspects of the discussion.
It's a perfectly legitimate and correct question to pose. I think we of course look with great concern to what goes on in the American political body in terms of having these voices. I think the current administration has its position, and the previous one has its, and they're different. Spokesperson keep on expressing itself of that. The EU on its side, just to be clear on it, officially the EU follows this United Nations Security Resolution 2334 from 2016, which basically recognized Golan, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip as occupied territory. It's a ruling from the Security Council basically that this is occupied territory. It means that annexation, which is what the current government of Israel wants to push forward, and it openly says that is void, it's illegitimate, it's illegal under international law. Any settlement building in these territories is illegal. Any forced displacement of Palestinians or inhabitants of these countries, it's illegal. So this all constitutes internationally recognized illegal acts. And I think this is not even contested by Israel's own laws, but the government has no intention of following it. And I think this is EU's official position, and it's a position that it has sort of restated as late as in 2022. So I think EU is on the right track in terms of taking out a position of this, as saying this, we follow this international law, and we encourage the EU to stick to that position. And I don't think that there are sort of signs that they will not stick to that position. What we are suggesting now is that given the blatant refusal to recognize this position by Israel, the EU should basically say, okay, in this case, we cannot keep on going as normal. We cannot have business as usual when we have a partner that doesn't recognize this, even in words. Now, in deeds, it has been the thing for a long while that the various Israeli governments didn't recognize it. But now you have a government that actually says, no, we will annex all of these countries. We believe that this greater Israel belongs to us, and we have no intention of recognizing international law. And this is why we are saying, well, faced with that, then the EU cannot keep that traditional position of saying, okay, we think this and we express concern when the others are doing something that is wrong, because now the other ones are saying we don't even agree to the basics of it. So the EU has to revise its position. And I think this is where we are sort of entering the stage with the small op-ed we did, but it's an extremely preoccupying situation for, I think, European policymakers. You correctly said that this preoccupies Americans as well, but I think for the European Union, it's a reckoning point. To what extent do we actually sort of are we able to take action on some of these very basic principles that we have at multiple occasions said that, of course, international law and international human rights law is the basics of the European Union. So now I'd also have to show that it actually means it and not just says it. That's what we're calling out here.
Yeah, and I think you're right there. I think we are going through a crucial point when it comes to EU support for Israel, not just EU, US as well. This government, it goes against everything which Europe is supposed to stand for. And one of the reasons we are where we are is partly because Europeans and Americans have for years and decades rewarding Israel's violations of international law and criminal behavior. And this is why we have such an extreme government in Israel. They know that the Europeans will do nothing, the Americans will do nothing. They've come to a point where they have to do something. And if we are to assume that the stars will align and they will do something, what can the EU do? You mentioned a number of points in your piece about how Israel and the EU has various forms of cooperation, financially and culturally in a number of ways. So what could the EU potentially do when it comes, if it wishes to? And has it ever leveraged its ties with Israel in response to its violation of human rights?
Yeah, these are many good questions. I'll see if I can keep them all in my head while we go into it. I think, yes, traditional, there has been acts previously where the EU has stalled its various instruments of cooperation and withheld some agreements and so on. And this the EU can perfectly well do again. I think one of the things that's interesting to look at, and which we're also pointing out in the op-ed we just briefly talked about before, is that the EU has last year, due to an analysis which says that the previous government was likely to be more sort of reformist than what we had seen before, sort of the post-Netanyahu-Lapid government that sat for about a year before the current Netanyahu-led government, that as a sign of sort of recognition that this was more like a mid-seeking, slightly less radical government, the EU then reopened its so-called Association Council, where the Council of Europe, meaning the sort of interstate intergovernmental body, would open up a dialogue with the Israeli government. And that was opened up after being stalled for many years, for almost 10 years. I think it's been frozen. So that was sort of defrozen or opened up again. And given that we're now back with an even more radical government than the previous one, under which it was actually frozen, I think that could be, or we think in this op-ed and suggest in the op-ed that this would be an obvious point, a starting point to reconsider that, or as a minimum, use that as a very, very strong platform for extremely critical dialogue, and calling out these failures to meet, and the basically expressing the complete unacceptance of that view expressed by the Israeli government, the current Israeli government, over sort of disdain for international law, and making sure that they understand that the EU will not stick with that and cannot stand up to such a position. I think we're exactly beyond anything else than the question that the EU cannot simply accept this. We are at a point where it so blatantly refuses to follow international law, the current government in Israel, so that of course the EU cannot just stick to business as usual. I think that should be conveyed as a minimum, but as an even better solution, look at that and freeze it until we have a better situation for cooperation there. I think on the other hand, EU is a major trade partner for Israel, and I think if we go back to the issue of occupation, it's illegal to basically have trade going on with done in settlement and in illegally occupied territories. And I think the European Union could look into their various trade agreements and see whether they actually are in breach with some of these international law that it itself claims to uphold. We know that there have been cases previously of some Israeli companies who actually violate some of these international laws that had trade. And this is sort of a due diligence work that should be done once again, and I think it should be ongoing. So we would also call for such a sort of revision of all current policies and make sure that the EU doesn't sort of indirectly support the upholding of illegal acts in the occupied territories.
Another thing you focused on in your op-ed was the double standard. I think the invasion of Russia has shown how what the EU is willing to do in defense of its values. It says, and a number of times we see European Union politicians, UK politicians here in the UK as well, no, we are willing to do such and such to defend democracy, our values, our principles. And the invasion of Ukraine showed exactly what they are willing to do. But as you know, when it comes to Israel-Palestine, there's very little they have done in terms of defending their values. So in your case, I mean, contrast that hypocrisy for us. You touched upon that. And how does that look? Have you heard European Union MPs, members speak about this, defend this, and explain away the what to many seems like blatant hypocrisy and double standards? What is their response normally when you pose those questions to them? Say, look, here you are willing to go to war, immiserate the lives of Europeans to defend Ukraine, and rightly so. But why are you not even willing to do the bare minimum when it comes to defending your values and principles against what is more looking more and more like far right, as some would say, fascist government in Israel?
No, yeah, I think it's perfectly right, and I would also say perfectly legitimate that there is a feeling in large segments around the world that this is that there is a double standard in the EU's approach to these two and multiple other cases, if we want to sort of expand it. I think the feeling that or the sort of the impressions that we've had over the past year is that from a position where this was so obviously a special case, Ukraine, in European foreign policy making, or in European politics, internal policy making, if you want. I think there's a growing understanding that not everybody would just immediately jump to the conclusion that the special attention should be given to this specific context just because it's intra-European, which seems like a sort of, how can I say, a self-evident point for many European policymakers, that of course they should stand firm when Russia does an annexation and just occupies territory in breach of international law, all the things that we from a Palestinian perspective could say, well, that's exactly what we've had for 50 years going on here. So I think at the beginning of this full year now of the Russian occupation, and not forgetting, of course, what happened back since 2014 in Ukraine, but in the beginning of the recent campaign of Russia in Ukraine, I think there was quite little awareness among European policymakers that their call for arms, so to say, their calls for solidarity around international justice and the sort of a rights-based and international system was met with some sort of flabbergasted surprise and for some actually an instantaneous feeling that this was just hypocrisy and double standards because you treat some occupations differently than others and so on and so forth, which was the response that it actually met, I think, in various segments around the world, and of course, more specifically for this context, and among Palestinian rights activists, saying that we've been calling for precisely these instruments to be put in place for a long while. How come you've never really sort of walked the walk here in our specific context, when you're so willing to walk the walk and use all this full host of instruments that we've seen rolled out, from both financial to military to international judicial and so on, and coalition building. So I think there is a sort of a fair case to bring forth of saying that, yes, this is a case of double standards, and that doesn't exclude the fact that these situations are, of course, as facts on the ground, also distinct and different, and the European Union will probably always answer somehow differently to something happening inside the European territory than outside. But that aside, I think it's clear that there is a double standard case in it. And I think that, and just to finish that series of reflections, this is increasingly, I think, dawning on European policymakers. So I've also noticed that they know, that they also say, yeah, it's regretful that we have actually not been able to, and so on and so forth. I think that the tipping point, this might be sort of a macro change in European politics, that, okay, now we really need to stand up for an international right-based order and so on. But I think the specific tipping point that we're looking at right now in the EU-Israeli relation is much more that we have a government that has come in with so extremist views that are so blatantly rejecting that international law should have any sort of a impact on their policy making, that pushes EU on a very different into an extremely complicated corner. So how can they respond to anything but say, okay, then we freeze the Association Council? How can they do anything but to say, okay, but if you actually openly say you want to annex territory that in defiance of international law that we say that we support, then it simply doesn't make sense for us anymore to have all these other instruments rolling, which are sort of the softer instruments of luring the Israelis towards a more sort of how can I say a more peace building process and so on, which is the European position. So I think that seems to be a tipping point that we also see amongst the European policymakers, that know that this is going to put pressure. What happens currently in Israel is putting pressure on European policymakers independently of Ukraine. But I think it's still a fair thing to say that there is a case of double standard, notwithstanding the distinct differences between the types of occupation we're seeing in these two contexts. But there is a clear case of double standards that European foreign policy makers are, I think, increasingly coming to terms with and understanding also as a case of double standard, understanding how that falls back negatively on the ability for the European Union to be what you just initially said, namely the hope for a neutral sort of platform for exchange and some sort of reasonable bringing parts together in the future. I mean, they cannot claim that position in any way if they are not sort of willing to also act when there's a blatant rejection to even recognize the fundamentals for the conversation.
Just to wrap up with one more final question, looking more broadly, one of the things you may have noticed is how people are quite cynical and non-trusting of governments when they say that they are defending international law, doing this, doing that. We see that clearly from the time of COVID, and of course, in the war in Ukraine. Usually more people would support a country when they go in defense of their values. But in this case, the argument doesn't seem to have convinced as many people as it should have. And one of the reasons, I want to just share an anecdote. I mean, a couple of years ago, about 10 years ago, I was at a conference at the European Union. And at the, again, talking on similar themes and topics about violations of international law and EU's inaction when it comes to Israel. And I posed a question to one of the EU members of parliament saying, is EU inaction undermining the undermining the efforts to combat totalitarianism, authoritarianism globally? We see over the last few years that anti-democratic forces, authoritarianism has really shot up all over the world. There are a number of countries that are more and more authoritarian. And people saw how the European Union, through their inaction in Palestine, that they're not really willing to defend their values and principles. And that in itself undermined international law, undermined the values which they claim to stand for, that undermined the international legal order, which now, following the war in Ukraine, they are so desperate to defend, they are so willing to sacrifice money and human lives. But I think that the chipping away at the system, chipping away at the European Union's legitimacy and claim to be upholding international law, began really with their inaction with Israel, inaction with stopping occupation, annexation, human rights abuse in Palestine. And this continuation has really tarnished its reputation. And in the eyes of many, they're cynical now. They're cynical over those claims. They're cynical and non-trusting of their government when they now say, okay, in Ukraine, we are going to defend human rights. So 10 years on, I think generally, I mean, do you think, there's a direct link between EU inaction when it comes to Israel and Palestine and its inability to, well, first of all, encouraging authoritarian forces around the world, like Putin and many others around the world, and also undermining its own effort to defend democracy around the world. So the story really begins long time ago, not now. I mean, which is why I see a lot of people generally being very cynical of those claims, very non-trusting of their government. And you open social media and you see alternative news sources, and people generally just don't trust their government when they say we are defending international law, we're defending our values, because they see it through the lens of Israel-Palestine, and any credibility they had previously is simply, been chipped away.
I think you're onto something right here. I think that I will go as far as say that definitely plays a role. I think you're perfectly right that this specific conflict has been both supercharged with meaning. It's so classic a case of annexation and breach of international law, and it's quite exposed. So it definitely plays into that process you're describing. I also think the process is bigger. It is a global phenomenon. It's linked to disinformation campaigns that are very actively being pushed out. So whenever there's sort of a lack of complete consistency in a foreign policy act here with what a country does there, then there are trolls or whatever activists ready to point it out and present this as being exactly the proof that nobody has a better case than others, and we're all just crooks in the end, and all state actors are just pursuing own interest and not sort of following value-based foreign policy. And I think that's another part of it, what you described, sort of a little bit like this sort of social media world we all live in, right? Where we meet these kind of arguments constantly, and they have some sort of truth in reality that states pursue also. How can I say, non-coherent policies where they may do something good over here and something pretty bad over here, and sort of it's good is right-based order and bad is not right-based order, seen from a human rights defender perspective. I think that's also part of the story. And then there's the third thing that what you chip into here as a story is, of course, closely linked also to other parts of how the EU has reacted or not reacted to Russian annexation previously of the Crimea, and just keep on trading gas and so on. So I think that, or let's say massive trade agreements with China, and in spite of what we now very well know goes on in Xinjiang, of sort of a massive sort of fascist way of treating the Muslim population there. So there are so many examples where actors are not clean cut, doing the right thing according to the value basis that they were supposed to put sort of at least as a part of the nexus of how they do foreign policy, trade policy, and in international politics. Now, I say this because I want to get to the point with this, which is to say, I still believe that the EU is one of the best bets. The EU is, how can I say, openly and fundamentally based on an international humanitarian law and international law and human rights. and democracy. These are sort of core principles for the entire construct, which we call the European Union. And I think that is our job as an NGO working on influencing and pushing the European Union, amongst other things that we do, is exactly to remind them of that and say, hey, you are supposed to, among all these actors, constantly keep this in mind. It has to be a part of your calculation when you do foreign policy. And I think EU is still a pretty good bet for that. I mean, there are other states that don't necessarily has that as the core fundamentals of their constitution. So I'll say that it's important to keep on reminding the European Union that they are based on these principles, that they are not just some actor amongst many other actors who can basically a little bit go to and fro and do a bit here and something else there, but they actually have a very clear set of values that were cut out after the Second World War for very specific reasons to actually prevent that we get into these blatantly abusive situations. And they should keep on keeping that in mind. Even though they forget, we will remind them. That's basically our job. So I remain, I wouldn't say cautiously optimistic even, but just aware that this is the mission. And this is why we keep on telling them, you cannot just forget that when you then start doing politics. You need to constantly keep it in mind, because you are one of the organizations we look to, amongst with a couple of other organizations, globally speaking, to uphold this. So in a sense, I'm like, yeah, I understand the cynicism. Yeah, I see double standards all over. And yeah, I think we should keep on calling it out, because that is exactly the only way to deal with that. When we deal with a partner like the European Union, with other partners, we can say, yeah, they're just crooks, basically, or yeah, that's a disinformation campaign. But I think in this specific case, I have some hope that we can call this institution, this organization, into basically respecting its own core values and policy, and basically do policies that follow that. So that's also why we push for such an, I would say, such a moment here of saying, okay, now's the time. Now's the time to reconsider. Now's the time to basically do the right thing.
Let's end on that point of hope and optimism, and let's hope that the stars do align and the EU does adopt a more value-based foreign policy, as it's shown in Ukraine. And I hope that that sentiment will carry through to Palestine. And frankly, there really isn't any other option at the moment, because this government is so extreme that it really undermines the credibility, and undermining of credibility is really chipping away at the legitimacy of governments around the world, so governments who claim to upholding democracy. I want to thank you, Rasmus, for joining us. It's been a thoroughly enjoyable discussion, and I want to thank those who have joined us and tuned in, and I hope to see you in another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Goodbye.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.